Right now on the Power Chord Hour, we're talking to multi-platinum producer Michael Beinhorn. Michael has been working with bands such as Hole, Social Distortion, Soul Asylum, The Violent Femmes, and many, many more in his career. He's recently started offering online pre-production services, so we're going to talk a little bit about that, as well as his 4 decades of producing. Michael, how are you today?
I'm wonderful, thanks. How are you?
Good. So, to start off, like I mentioned, you've been in the business now for 4 decades. Do you just want to give us, like, a quick rundown how your producing career got started, how you got into all of this?
Um, yeah, I kind of lapsed into it really like everything else. It wasn't anything that was kind of pre-planned. It was nothing that I had any ambitions toward. It was just, it just kind of picked me, basically. I made myself available, and it sort of showed up that way. Like, I started playing in a band. After 5 years, we somehow managed to produce a record and co-write with Herbie Hancock, and that record was really big. And then I stopped working with that particular group of artists, and I went off on my own. And 4 years after that, I wound up working with a band called the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And the rest from there is history.
that's quite a way to get in. Even starting with Herbie Hancock. And the interesting thing to me is, with all your credits and everything, you didn't like grow up with aspirations to be a producer or anything.
No, I can't say it was the furthest thing from my mind, but it just wasn't anything that was on my radar at all.
So before that, I know, like you said, you were in a band and everything. So you were never into like the behind the scenes part. You were always just kind of, you were the player. You were the guy on the record more or less.
Yeah, and even funnier is the fact that I couldn't really play.
Okay. So that also goes. So you're not like classically trained or anything either. You're really self-taught in all of this.
I had some piano lessons when I was younger, but essentially I'm an autodidact. That's where it all came from. I took synth lessons when I was in like my late teens. So I learned how to operate a modular synthesizer. And then I think I'd say conceptually a lot of what I do kind of comes from that methodology. Mm-hmm. But yeah, for the most part, it's pretty much, I just learned as I went, essentially.
Really?
And yeah, that's it.
So, in your experience with working with bands, I've always kind of wondered this. Is it easier for you to produce a band that is, say, kind of more new, maybe looking for their sound, than an established act? Like, just kind of one example, I know, like working with Social Distortion, a band like that, who was a band for almost 20 years beforehand, already kind of had an established sound. Do you find it harder to, like, convey ideas and kind of give recommendations for, like, older, more established bands? Is it easier to do that with younger bands, do you think? Kind of give them direction?
I don't think that there's like a hard, fast rule that kind of binds that. It really depends on the personalities. With Social Distortion, I think, they were really open. Mm-hmm. And Mike was ready. They were all ready to work extremely hard to do that. I've been in some situations where people are incredibly stubborn and intractable and don't want to do, and either don't want to do anything because they've just been doing it for too long and they just feel like doing things the way they do it, or they don't like being told what to do by anybody, so I take on a position of being more like an authority figure, but fortunately that's been the exception rather than the rule.
Good. Like when they come in like that, yeah, do you have to like kind of take them out of that place? Because that seems like that could really like ruin a recording session and maybe even bleed through on the record. If you can tell, okay, this guy's disinterested, he's kind of going through the motions now. Do you kind of have to do that as a producer sometimes, like break into them and get them kind of into that, I don't know if you want to call it a zone, like to actually, record and everything?
A lot of times that has to be done very passively. I think from my perspective, I found that trying to kind of jump in, especially with someone who's resistant mm-hmm. to any kind of outside influence, it can be very difficult, even if you come to them with like an immense amount of enthusiasm for what they do. Because some people just look at that. They look at that with suspicion, like you're trying to blow smoke up their ass to essentially get them to do something that they don't want to do. So it depends again on the personality of the individual you're working with. I mean, I've just found that in some cases I've had to be a passive contributor in that case, which is it's very difficult to explain how that would work, but it's almost like feeding people ideas and making them think that they're their ideas and not mine.
Do you feel like that's part of the job, or when that comes up, if you kind of went like, this isn't my job, this isn't what I was hired for?
It's all my job, man. The only thing that's not my job is, I think there's a certain point where you wind up taking on too much stuff as a producer, and I feel that when I'm being encumbered with all kinds of stuff that really kind of draws my attention away from the process of making the best recording possible, then I'm going to draw back and say I'm not doing this. So But as far as the psychological aspect of it, as far as trying to get the best performances out of people, to me, it's a case of by any and all means necessary.
So, like I mentioned earlier, you've recently started offering a really cool pre-production service. You want to tell us a little bit about that and what services you're offering?
Yeah, well, on the most basic level, it starts with song analysis, which is essentially breaking down a person's music into, basically disassembling it and kind of identifying not just the parts that are working, but the aspects of it that aren't working, because that's the key to making the song better. Now, that's not to say that you can take a song that is essentially not great and making it great. I would say that's an absolute impossibility. But it does guarantee that you can take a piece of music that is mediocre but has potential and strip all the mediocre elements out to make it a better song. And the results from that are pretty staggering, especially when people see how it works. And this is based on work that I've done over the past 35 years. I've seen this type of methodology in action and how it can really alter people's work. And I've been able to get essentially every record I've worked on after a certain point had this particular approach kind of built into it. So people who use this service are essentially using the same dynamics that were applied to records like Super Unknown and things like that. And from there it extrapolates into project analysis, pre-production, executive production, which is more overarching, but incorporates all the other aspects. In some cases, I'll wind up going to where people are working to rehearse with them to kind of to review what's happening. Mm-hmm. I guess it's sort of it's kind of a la carte. But there's some basic building blocks to it, and I really did it because I've noticed that there's such a lack of emphasis on these things now, and I feel very strongly that is a major reason why a lot of people nowadays aren't making records of the kind of quality that they could and should be doing. I mean, there's no deficit in creative people in the world, but a lot of people now are making comments like, "Oh, music isn't that as good these days. Records aren't as great these days," and a lot of it has to do with the simple fact that people aren't doing the right kind of prep work. Prep work doesn't just come from a bunch of guys in a rehearsal studio, especially since that's been I think that as a valuable kind of tool in and of itself hasn't really kind of yielded results for many years, and that's essentially because a lot of the onus for that fell onto people who are in more of a production role to kind of help out to provide to provide an objective input, and that's been stripped away because budgets have really kind of have evaporated from the recording process, and I felt it was time to really bring this stuff back, but to make it available to as many people as possible.
And I mean, as we've went on, and it makes it more accessible for bands to self-produce, record them, stuff themselves. Do you think then that that's been lost? Like the idea that, a producer's not just someone who like hits record or goes, okay, here, here's your guitar tone. It's like, do you think that a lot of modern music is maybe missing something because it becomes almost too insular, maybe, where there's no outside source? Like you're talking about, like people aren't realizing that, hey, you don't write these classic albums just by, a band goes in and writes 12 classic songs. You need to like work on this. You need that outside perspective. I mean, do you think that's what's missing a lot?
Man, this is the point that I'm trying to make. This is exactly the point I'm trying to make. I think, and it's obvious. Like all you have to do is go back to demo recordings of some of your favorite bands. Like I like to collect outtakes, studio outtakes of bands like Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, artists like those who have done some of the most seminal recordings of all time. But it's not because I enjoy listening to different versions of their songs. It's mainly because I like to see the process. I like to see the process of how they worked on certain pieces of music, and you can hear them in the studio, like hammering away at stuff and hammering and hammering and hammering until they got something right. Now, I notice that these days, when people have a song, they might work on it a little bit, but after that, they're kind of like, well, we're done, and it's time to record it without really without having the ability to take a step back. Because honestly, as a songwriter, one of the hardest things in the world is to be objective about your own music. I mean, that's just common sense. It's absolute common sense that as the creator, it's very difficult for you to have complete perspective, especially on something that other people are going to have to listen to and decide whether or not they like. So it makes perfect sense to have someone else come in and to be able to identify things that perhaps you may have missed. Or in the case of songwriters, many of whom I've experienced this with, who are actually very sensitive and understand and actually can feel where a piece of music they've written isn't working, but are unable to figure out why, or really to be able to describe what's wrong. Mm-hmm. To have a person in my position identify that exact thing and actually give them the relief of knowing that they were right all along. There was something wrong, but hey, here's a solution. I mean, the possibilities are so vast for this type of thing. And yeah, I do honestly, I believe wholeheartedly that the absence of this ability to be introspective and also to be able to have access to other people who are professionally skilled at being able to analyze music, I feel that this has been a tremendous detriment to people who are trying to record popular music, and that's one of the main reasons that I'm doing this.
So do you feel too, I mean, like in modern day, does the producer, do you feel like that title kind of gets lost too? Because once again, like I said, you can do so much on your own. Doesn't mean you should, but it's like, I feel like people can throw around the word producer more, and yet they're lacking so much of the stuff you're talking about. I mean, you have this, you basically have a set of skills, it sounds like, going in that, you just can't have when you're writing on your own. You have that inside perspective, and you can't look at it from the outside. You're on the inside. There's no way to look at it in a different direction. So, I mean, even looking at your biggest, probably most successful albums you've worked on, I mean, they probably changed pretty drastically then from what bands brought you, talking about pre-production and all that. Like, I'm sure bands didn't just hand in, here's 12 demos, and this thing is going to, this thing's going to go multi-platinum. You had to work on that, didn't you?
Yeah, well, there's absolutely no question that the title of producer has been, I mean, to put it in very, I guess, conservative terms, abused considerably. And I think I don't think that it's wrong necessarily for anyone to call themselves a producer if all they are doing is pressing a space bar or telling an artist, here's your guitar sound. I just know that there are many different varieties of producer in the broad spectrum of people who do that. My perception of what a producer is considerably different than that. Producer, from my perspective, is someone who's a creative collaborator in the artist process, who is there to facilitate a deeper experience for the artist of what the artist is doing himself. As far as records that I've worked on, I mean, I can give you a perfectly good example of what you just asked. Like on Super Unknown, when I got the initial demos for the album, it was about 11 songs, and I'd say 3 to 4 of them were actually recordable. Everything else was scrappable. And I had the unenviable task of having to go back to these guys and to say this to them, you know, but that was the reality of the situation. They needed to hear it from somebody because they were in the position to make a great record, but they, at that point in time, they weren't going to do it with the material that they had. So they basically had to start, I wouldn't say from scratch, because they had some songs that were good, one of which actually became a single, but everything else was pretty much filler. And beyond that, you know, the rest of the remaining demos were unusable. You know, so they worked for 2 months, and I was constantly providing input and guidance as far as what they were doing. And at the end, we wound up with the material for, you know, for what you know as Super Unknown. But if the record had been put out that they were planning on making based on the initial demos that I got, you would not recognize that record.
Oh,
it
wow.
would not be the same recording. Oh no, I mean, most of the songs that are familiar on that record wouldn't even exist.
So, I mean, do you feel like sometimes you need to like write your record more than once before the end result? I mean, like when a band comes in, then are you basically, is that something you have to set up? Like okay, you're probably going to write this maybe twice. You know, like what you bring into me might not even be what the public knows.
I don't really think that that's a conversation to be had until after the music has been reviewed. You know, it's because it's nothing that you can really know for sure. You know, for example, you don't know how many times you're going to have to ask for more songs from the artist until you've had a chance to listen to what they're doing and until they've sent you more stuff. You know, sometimes a batch of demos really kind of identify a specific type of trajectory from the artist. You know, and that kind of, that's feedback for me, because I take that and I go, am I giving this person the right kind of input to help steer him in the direction he needs to go? In the case of Super Unknown, for example, like there was a point in time where I got a batch of about 11 or 12 songs from Chris, who was the primary writer on the record. And I realized that he was really veering off in the wrong direction, because I had 11 or 12 songs, all of which were pretty average. You know, we were very far away from having the right kind of material at that point for the record. And I had to speak with him directly about this and really, you know, have a conversation that I think most people would not want to have, you know, because it really kind of, it delved into the sort of like, you know, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Like, what is this for? You know, what are you hoping to achieve here? And that conversation gave me enough insight to be able to give him the type of input he needed to write the rest of the songs for the record. Now, I have to say, this doesn't always happen. You know, you can't always guarantee that that's going to happen, but at least in this particular instance, it worked out.
Yeah,
you know?
it sounds like, I mean, part of that success, I mean, like you're saying, if it was an album that we didn't, you know, like what it started out with was so different. It's like that album more than likely probably never would have been big then. It's like you don't, as big as it was too. I mean, it's a monster of an album, and it sounds like that wouldn't have happened without production, working on things, you know, having those hard conversations you're talking about, things that a producer does, you know, that
nowhere close. I mean, one of the songs on the first demo that I got was Spoon Man. But that was the only song on that entire batch that was, I think actually My Wave was on there too, which I think got released as a single somewhere down the road. But that's, while I really do love that song a lot, it's really not up to the standard of some of the songs that were actually released as singles over the course of the that record's time post release. Like it really, we had to go through an awful lot to just get it to the right standard material wise before we could even think of going into a recording studio.
I think you brought this up a little bit earlier, but I kind of want to touch on it again. Like how long can you work on a song before you can tell that it's going to work or not? Like is it almost instant, or do you like try to maybe do everything you can to, obviously someone brings you a song, it's their baby. It's like, how long can you tool on it before you just have to go like, this song's just not good?
It really depends. There are, in my experience, it's not a very long process. I mean, for one thing, if you have a piece of music that's great, it's going to be pretty obvious to someone at some point, And then there are pieces of music that take years sometimes to get home. I mean, for example, if you listen to demos of some Led Zeppelin songs, you can hear the process that they went through, where from the point of origin for the music, for the song, to the point where they felt ready to record it, to the finished product. I mean, what's really funny is I have a demo recording of No Quarter, which is off Houses is the Holy, and the version I have is a bossa nova version. The song, I believe, was actually conceived as a bossa nova version, which if you listen back to it now, you can hear traces of it, because melodically, there are things that are very out of place for a rock song, like that da 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 da. That break between the A section and the chorus. This is the path where no one goes. But the thing is that on this original demo, the part goes da do da do da do da doom ba bum ba boom ba bum ba boom da do da do 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 do, and then it goes into ba 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 ba. So it all makes sense in that format. But they eventually broke it away from that type of rhythmic approach, and they turned it into a slow rock song. So the traces, the bits and pieces, the artifacts that were left over from the original demo are actually really, really, they kind of give the song a kind of flavor that it wouldn't otherwise have had. So very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, talking too about your work. I mean, the term watershed record gets thrown around a lot, and I think rightfully so. I think you've made a lot of career-defining albums. I mean, we've been talking about Soundgarden, Super Unknown. You did Whole Celebrity Skin. I mean, Soul Asylum's Grave Dancers Union, obviously their biggest record. I mean, going into albums like this, is it a conscious effort that you're like going in and trying to really like you have a lot running on this. These are bands that have a lot running on these albums. Like, do you go in feeling a pressure like you're now responsible for trying to bring those, bands to the next level? Or is that not even something you were thinking of, like recording these records? That was something that came later on.
My perspective has always been the same. I have to try and make the best possible record I can with these artists. It's not merely a matter of going into a recording studio and getting a body of work out of them, like something that can be exploited. Nowadays, I think the perspective is more, let's get a record out so we can tour it for the next year and a half and make a bunch of money off touring. My attitude was always, and it always has been, we have to make the best possible record now. Like, this is going to be the best possible piece of work that this artist is capable of. How's that going to happen? What does that look like in terms of like an overriding vision? So yeah, I mean, and I do tend to put a lot of pressure on myself to be able to help realize that vision, and to at least hold it in my own consciousness and find, and find the ways to translate that vision from an abstract concept into a concrete reality.
Very nice. So, I mean, right now, you're obviously getting started with your pre-production services. You're doing that. Are you working on anything else currently?
I'm working on developing a college curriculum with a colleague of mine named Frank Filippetti. That's really going to be that's going to be an educational platform for people who are interested in engineering and production. Um, but we're trying to combine technical aspects of recording education, which most people are familiar with more of a philosophical approach, which no one else is really doing. And I feel this is important because I don't think that I've encountered anyone who is involved or who has kind of come through the whole educational system as far as music production goes, who really has a clear sense of why they're doing what they're doing. And I just think that's so important among certain other things. So we want to take a completely different perspective on this. But yeah, I mean, those are essentially my two main focuses at this point. And as you can imagine, doing this kind of work, doing pre-production, it's pretty time intensive because it involves a lot of listening. You know, I'd say it probably involves at least as much, if not more, listening than being in our studio producing a record.
I mean, this is probably a pretty like broad question. I'm sure a lot of things would jump in your mind, but it just interests me, since you've been doing this now since the 80s. I mean, it'd be an understatement to say like how much the music industry has had to change since then. Also recording technology. I mean, I'm sure you basically saw it go from analog to digital. I mean, is there like one or two things that really jump out in your head, like through your career, of like either technological advances or, just something that really changed that blew you away or kind of caught you off guard?
Oh man, yeah, like you said, there's so many. Like
that might be a hard one to answer, but I'd like to pick your brain.
The scope is so big. Like, I mean, because the thing is that you can find positives and negatives. Like, I remember toward the end of the 90s, standing around with a bunch of people who I regard very highly. Like I was in a group with some of the finest producer engineers in history.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, I always just would marvel at how I managed to get up in such rarefied air when those things would happen. But these guys are just standing there laughing about the idea of how anyone could possibly make a rock record using like digital. They
might have been a little wrong.
They might have been a little wrong. I mean, these are all guys, by the way, who use Pro Tools now and, who use DAWs. But, they were all standing around just laughing riotously. Like, how could you possibly do that? Like, it's the wrong sound. It's the wrong sonic combination. You can't make guitars and drums sound good on a digital audio workstation, which was certainly true back then. And I mean, admittedly, it does have its own sound, and it's hard to say that it's always the best sound for for a rock record.
I mean, do you almost feel like during that time too, like you working with that technology, were you guys almost guinea pigs? Because that's the thing. It's like there's so many kinks and stuff to work out. I mean, do you just feel like maybe back then, like when it started, it wasn't on par, like if that makes sense. Digital recording in the beginning, was it harder to use then? Like, were their criticisms valid, do you think, in the beginning?
I don't disagree with them. I mean, I still feel that like that PCM audio in general is not a good source to record to. It's not an ideal source. Like, I would choose something else before, although I've had to use PCM based recording devices repeatedly, which in turn forced me to go to much higher resolution audio to be able to get the kind of sound that I wanted. But yeah, I mean, necessity forces your hand unless you feel comfortable with the solution that you're given. Most people in this day and age are looking at cost as a factor, but they're also looking at ergonomics, as far as what makes their workflow comfortable and easy, and something that's repeatable. And I think that causes people to kind of get stuck in a groove and stay in a very comfortable place. I never enjoyed that. When we made Untouchables, the Korn record, my they wanted a very specialized type of record, and all I could think of was like, we can't possibly record this at normal low res digital. So my feeling was that we had to do everything at the highest res possible, which was a very interesting situation because at that point in time, there were only a few recording devices that were capable of giving me what I wanted in terms of sample rate and, resolution. So we wound up using a Euphonics R1, which is no longer made because it actually is a dinosaur. And, Pro Tools didn't have a 96K platform back then. So, and the R1 didn't really edit. So we had to get this Nuendo program by Steinberg, which is, it's known today, but it was the first 96K editing platform that was available. And yeah, I mean, we were at the bleeding edge the whole time, and it was pretty agonizing. Their interface was bad. Everything was bad. My Frank Filippetti, who was engineering that record, was on the phone with Steinberg, who manufactured Nuendo, like every day, like yelling at them.
Jeez.
because they created this very high resolution recording technology, but they provided a user interface to a computer that was essentially that had like it had like latency of like 5 or 6 or 7 milliseconds. I don't even remember what it was, but it wasn't AES. It wasn't even SPDIF based. It was something that was like that. They figured that they were going to make this high res system, and then they were going to market it to people who were bedroom producers. And we were like, then why make 96K? This is high res audio. Are you crazy? Like, they didn't understand. And I think that they could have really cornered the market on their product, which is a shame because I think it's actually superior, or at least it was back then. But yeah, I mean, it was constant bleeding edge type stuff. But you know what? That's the fun. To me, to be able to kind of aspire to something better, to shoot for something higher than what's there, to imagine something that can be an improvement over what's, I guess, the norm. That's where you improve your results, and you wind up with something that no one else has done before.
Well, Michael, this has been, really fun, really informative. Where can people find you online and get more information on your pre-production services? Stay up to date with you.
MichaelBeinhorn.com.
All right, and then
that's the place.
Anything else you want to add or promote?
No, I think that's my book, of course, Unlocking Creativity. Can't forget that.
And can you find that on your website then?
Yeah, you can find it on my website, on Amazon. It definitely it digs into a little bit into my philosophy as far as working and recording and creativity.
I like
that. Good primer.
I have to check that out because even with us talking to you now, I think what I've realized, and hopefully listeners realize, you come from a very interesting place where, like you said, you had no background in this, no real aspirations for it, yet you kind of fell in and through your own, I think, doing trial and error and just working really hard, it seems like you've really found a formula that works. So I think that would be very neat to read, and also like you mentioned, doing the college course. Someone who goes at it from a different direction than I went to school for 5 years, and I have my Pro Tools certificate, and I have this and that. You come from a more genuine place. But thank you very much for calling in today.
It was my pleasure, man. Thank you.